Start recording. Okay, so where are we? Hopefully this will all come through. As I was saying, I have very little space left on this machine, so as long as I don't talk too long, we'll be able to fit this video on. Otherwise, it will crash halfway through. But there you go. So just remind myself. Yes, we left Jesus in the south, and actually in Luke's Gospel, we read about him having a meal at the house of someone called Simon the Pharisee. It's interesting because in the context of the house of Simon the Pharisee, we meet an immoral woman. She's just called that. But she looks like she's probably Mary Magdalene. But it's a little bit confusing because he doesn't call her Mary, but straight after we've met her, chapter 8, chapter 7 of Luke, Jesus is having a meal. It doesn't say it's in the south, but because we've been putting these events together, we can see it's just around Jerusalem. Jesus is having a meal with a guy called Simon, and a woman who's considered to be immoral comes in. She falls down. She's weeping on Jesus' feet, if you remember. Her tears fall on his feet. She's wearing a little thing of perfume around her neck. She anoints Jesus' feet. Now, we all know at the end of Jesus' ministry, Jesus is in the south, eating a meal at the name of somebody else called Simon. Now, it could be someone different, or it could be the same person, because Simon is the most common name in Jesus' day around Judea and Galilee. It's the most common Jewish name. But this time, a woman comes in who's also seen as immoral, but she's now got a huge, enormous amount of perfume, a really expensive, about a year's worth of perfume, and she tips it on his head. And it goes down to his feet, and then she wipes it on his feet. And the incidents are very similar. And people say, why is one here and one there? Actually, my own understanding is that it's the same people, but different time. Because this first one is the first meeting of Mary as an immoral. She's just had 7 demons cast out of her. Well, we don't know if she has at this point. Because if we look at the flow of the story, the immoral woman comes in and she cries on Jesus' feet. She puts a bit of perfume on his feet. She's criticised by those around, and Jesus is implicitly criticised. And he responds and says that actually she's forgiven much because she loves much. And then straight after that, we read right at the beginning of chapter 8 of Luke about Mary Magdalene, from whom Jesus cast 7 demons. So this may be their first meeting. Does that make sense? In this context, she's not someone who's well known. She's just the immoral woman who cries on the feet, and so on. And actually then what we have at the end of Jesus' ministry is a kind of a deliberate reenacting, but now with new meaning, if I can put it that way. Because at the end, she tips oil on Jesus' head. She effectively is anointing him, like you would for a priest or king. She's still seen as immoral, because nobody forgets. They know the town, if you see what I mean. It's down in Bethany, it's down in the south, just outside Jerusalem, which is where we can see the timing, same sort of location. Does that make sense? But rather than say, oh, it's just that for some reason Luke got the order wrong, because actually it's slightly different. It's actually what we're having is, here is the initial meeting, and somehow, because this is actually, we do that, don't we? Have you never noticed that? We tend to deliberately revisit things that are significant. You know, that if you at your wedding, you often dance to the thing that you first danced with your, people have that kind of, we can deliberately go back to places, but now it's got new meaning. So I think this kind of little incident, the reason why I want to kind of highlight is happening just outside Jerusalem is because actually it allows you to see that possibility, the possible connection between the same players, the same people. And so, a sinful woman anoints Jesus' feet with tears and perfume. She declares the woman she loved much. 3 verses later, Luke tells us about Mary Magdalene, who is now following Jesus up in Galilee. Now, if you know your geography, I'd say that. I'm laughing because I'm not expecting anybody to instantly be there. Okay, but surely Magdala is a place in Galilee. But why would Mary Magdalene be called coming from Magdalene if she comes from Magdala? But actually, the word Magdala it's a place name, but it is just a proper word. So in other words, it doesn't mean that she has to come from there at all. It actually is used figuratively to mean something that's tall or even statuesque. there is a tower in Jerusalem called the Mary Magdalene. It was built by Herod the Great because it was the tall, beautiful tower. Does that make sense? So it could be, quite simply, it is a description of kind of the fact she's a tall, beautiful woman, if I can, that it can be as simple as that. She seems to be striking and confident, and she seems, when we put her story together, she seems to be on the outskirts of Herod's of Herod the king's court. And now remember, I haven't got a map up there. Herod Antipas is king in Galilee, but also down in the south. And so you can imagine, because actually this is the way that the wealthy often work, is they often do attract attractive young girls into the kind of the thing, and they are often seen.
Next slide.
Oh, is it next slide? Why is it not working? Oh, it's because I've got to get back onto. There we go. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So here you go. So Herod controls up here, and he controls down here. Bethany is just on the other side of the Jordan here. But actually, you can imagine how she could get drawn in to that community, because she's not called a prostitute. She's just called an immoral woman. Because actually, that's the way we think about girls that get drawn into that kind of environment, don't we? You think of it like that. It's not fair, because often they are vulnerable in the way they get drawn in. It's actually more the problem with the with the expectations of that kind of power base. But she seems to be friends with various folks, Joanna and Susanna, who are also part of Herod's court. So you can kind of see a beginning of a bit of a story kind of connecting for Mary, and this is perhaps her first meeting down in the south when Jesus is down there. So if Simon the Pharisee from Luke is Simon the healed leper, because he's clearly not a leper when Jesus meets with him, maybe they're the same person. Maybe there's a story here that we don't know about him getting healed. In which case the town where Jesus is eating this meal would be Bethany, which is, of course, is totally consistent with the geography. So I've got the conclusion. So Mary of Bethany could also therefore be Mary who's called Magdalene, because that's actually what it says about her. She's Mary who's called Magdalene, Mary who's called the Tower. And when you hear that, the Tower, you can think of 10 reasons why she might be called the Tower, can't you? Even the fact that she's such a significant figure in the end doesn't necessarily mean she has to come from the town called Magdala. So, have I gone the right way? No, I've gone the wrong way. Okay. Jesus kind of heads up from there back to Galilee, and we have the story of the man who's with a withered hand. And there are multitudes start coming from many places. And actually this multitude starts to come in now. We read at the beginning of Matthew when he did the summary statement about word going out and multitudes coming. But actually this is now beginning to get the detail of the multitudes. So we've had Jesus kind of moving around, significant things happening, word spreading. We're just about to start to hit a point now where the numbers are really going to start to kind of take off. So another Sabbath, Jesus entered the synagogue with a man whose hand was withered. The experts in the laws of the Pharisees watched Jesus closely to see if he'd heal on the Sabbath. But he knew their thoughts and said, is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath or to do evil, save a life or destroy it? Looking around, he said, stretch out your hand. And the man did so, and his hand was restored. Now, they were filled with mindless rage and began debating one another what they should do. The reason I put the story here is, and I think the reason the Gospels have done, is what we discover as we move on from here is it becomes harder and harder for Jesus to operate in synagogues. And it's probably not the only incident, because as we see a lot of things come together, but the Gospels have put it there as a kind of a turning point. Because what we then discover is that some Pharisees come up from Jerusalem, where Jesus has just been for the last few months. They come up and they start to spread the story that he's doing this by demonic power. Remember, he's casting out demons by the Lord of the demons, and that story now starts to be spread. And so it seems that the synagogues start to close down to Jesus, because we find he's doing less now in synagogues as we move on from here. He does them more out in spaces and so on. It's not that he's not done those before, and it's not that he never ever gets back into a synagogue again. But up until this point, we regularly see Jesus in synagogues. Now suddenly he's out in open spaces, and part of the reason seems to be because of this message that starts to come up that he's doing these things, but you really don't want to receive him because we're not sure where his spiritual authority comes from. And so the synagogues seem to start closing down. You can that makes sense. You can understand that, can't you? You know, that happens in Christendom, doesn't it?
Yeah,
someone with a that's right. Someone with a healing ministry, and then suddenly the story starts going around that you shouldn't receive this person anymore because of where it comes from. So Jesus went away with his disciples to the sea, you see, and a great multitude from Galilee followed him. So he's not trying to do it anymore in the synagogues. As I say, it's not that he's never back there, but it seems that that becomes more the exception than the rule, whereas up to now it's been the other way around. He's doing both things, open air, but on the whole he's getting into synagogues at the time when people are expecting to be challenged by something spiritual. Now he has to move out, and then they start to gather wherever he goes. And that's different, because with John, he would be settled in one place, and they would just, over time, the word would go. What we now see with Jesus is they get there really quickly. Because the crowd, because of the crowd, he told the disciples to have a small boat ready for him, so the crowd wouldn't press towards him. And he healed many who were afflicted, and diseases pressed towards them in order to touch him. Whenever the unclean spirits saw him, they fell down and cried out, "You are the Son of God," but he sternly ordered them not to make him known. Yeah, there we go. So I had a slide to say. At this point, we now start seeing Jesus doing mass things in open spaces. And we start to see him teaching in parables much more. Because when he's teaching disciples, who you see in synagogues, often done in the teaching is done from a seated position. It's kind of face to face. You can answer questions as they come. Now you're having to project, and actually the stories have to be much simpler. And then they have to. And there's a genius in the parables. The genius of the parables is they're not simple little kind of stories with one meaning to them. They are stories that people would have to stop and think about. And all of them in Jesus' day have an emotional content to them, which we don't feel. The reason we don't feel it is because they have become religious stories to us. But it's interesting if you see someone who's never heard one, hear some of the stories. So, for instance, the parable of the workers who go out at different times during the day, you know, there are certain contexts where there's a strong trade union context. You told that story, and they would be absolutely outraged. And the reason I'm saying that, I'm not making make a joke or whatever. I'm just saying actually we miss. It's an emotionally disturbing story, and you might say, do you know what? It's the business. And one of the things we don't sometimes get is that Jesus told stories to be talked about. They weren't simple one-to-one analogies. We sometimes draw points from them, but that's because we've talked about them and made a conclusion. And somebody else talks about them and has another conclusion. Who's right and who's wrong is actually, the point was the story is told into a context which needs, that's what's so powerful about it. Does that make sense? Is not necessarily that we found the exact right answer, but that we've talked about it and it's challenged me. And it kind of draws me. And that's the style of teaching that Jesus goes into. And at this point, we also find Jesus' family is drawing back, because Jesus is now becoming a controversial figure. It's not that people didn't find him controversial, but remember at the beginning of John's Gospel, Nicodemus comes to him, and we sometimes hear it, we'll look at it properly, but we sometimes hear the story as though Nicodemus comes at night because he's trying to hide from. He doesn't. He comes with a team of people. We've just missed it. I'll show it to you when we go through it. He's actually coming to see Jesus as rabbi to rabbi. And he comes with a group. He refers to the we, and Jesus responds to the we. And they don't just mean the two. If you look at the context, what Nicodemus is saying, I've got my folks here. We've been talking about you. And the reason they come at night is because that's when rabbis meet. Okay, just being really blunt. In the Middle East, it's hot during the middle of the day. You tend to sleep and siesta. And because you slept in the afternoon, you're awake in the evening. And it's the time when you do those things. You have kind of conversations and meals and so on in those social contexts. So So at the beginning, yes, Jesus is controversial, but there are lots of folks asking kind of questions. It's not. But we're suddenly hitting a point where there's an official position is now going out from Galilee, from Jerusalem. Pharisees have come up, and they're beginning to go and tell folks, don't receive. And this is the context where Jesus now commissions the 12 to go out with authority. So we're now moving from them travelling with him to now Jesus is now going to start sending you out. And you're going to go out and you're going to do it. And so at this point, of course, now as they start to go out, there are multiple voices popping up all over the place. And now they're now all preaching the kingdom of heaven is hand, and they're all doing miracles. I have not touched in this quick overview. We will do it when we go a bit slower, the sections where John has been executed. But John has been executed in this period. I'm sorry. I laugh at the most. I sometimes think, why can I laugh there? John has been executed at this point, and it's, but suddenly there's this shortly after John's execution, Herod is hearing stories back. There's so and so, because he has a network of spies in every town and village. It's well historically documented. The network was established by Herod the Great, and Herod Antipas very wisely, because you don't last long as a king if you don't, maintained it. So every town has someone who reports back to Herod. And so he's suddenly hearing from across the whole of Galilee, which he's king of, there's a story coming up, and there's a bloke came in, and he was teaching the kingdom of heaven is at hand, and so-and-so's daughter got healed, and so-and-so's leg grew, and all of these stories, and they're coming back from everywhere. So he's thinking, and he's feeling the pressure of the fact that he's executed John, because he wasn't 100% for it, but he was pressured by his wife. And so he's done that, and so of course that's in that kind of context. They regather to Jesus, because it's probably and at that point, Jesus, they regather to Jesus. They're actually at Bethsaida at this point, and they go out. They're outside because they can't go into the synagogues, and it's where the huge crowd come. Jesus, they're trying to pursue Jesus as he tries to find space. They've heard about John the Baptist's death, and he ministers and feeds 5,000 men, women, and children. And then he sends the disciples off, if you remember, and that night he joins them, walks on the water. But the next day they've gone across. I'm not sure if the next one's a map. Is it a map?
Yeah.
Oh, it is a map. Oh yeah, but it's not for the same reason. I was going to say, if I put the map up though, Bethesda is on. Here's the Jordan goes up. See the top part of the Jordan there. Bethesda is just this side of the Jordan, and they want to go. They're going across from just by Bethesda. Just to it's not a very long journey. Just popping up to this side here, from where you can walk to Capernaum. But because the river runs in, it's also quite tricky because it pushes the boats kind of south. So it's a hard journey, but not very long in that kind of context. So they've gone off this way. And most people have walked home at night, but it's kind of Jesus joins them on the boat. But they get off, and there's a massive crowd waiting for him. And they've heard the story of the night before. It's kind of drifted back across because they start demanding. They want to see it. They want to see the miracle. Sorry, I've gone. I'll go back here. Where are we? This frenetic in Gennesaret, there are people grabbing at Jesus that are looking for healing. And in that context, they also make quotes about him providing bread for them. Which is actually one of the things that right at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, he said will be a problem in Galilee. Is they just want the miracles. They're not interested in the message. They just want the miracles. There is a really fascinating bit, just doing a quick plug, in the book that's coming out on Jesus in the Psalms, where you will see that actually some of that story of demanding bread and rejecting Jesus, because in the context of demanding bread, in this context, he says, unless you eat of my body and drink of my blood, and then there's a lot of people then drift away from Jesus. And that's actually predicted in the Psalms, the falling away and the demand for bread. So if you want to, when the book comes out, you'll see that one is in there. Just kind of throwing that one in. So as a result of things getting so frenetic, they're just trying to grab at Jesus. There's so on. He actually, I'm not sure if that was the right. I may be slightly wrong on that timing wise. Anyway, Jesus heads up out of the Galilee region because actually he's trying to find space. I think, just being very blunt. And part of the mix, it was beginning to get difficult. He sent the 12 out there doing stuff. Because what the 12 is doing is, at one level, it creates an instant release because there's now more people doing it, but at the same time, it's becoming a bigger and bigger show, if I can put it that way. And so now Jesus tries to get out, and he goes up to Tyre, and we have that story of the Syrophoenician woman who picks up he's there. And sometimes we read it, it feels difficult because Jesus seems to be turning her away. But you can kind of imagine the scenario where he said to his disciples, I need space. He's in the house. She's found out and she's trying to get in. And they're saying, sorry, he's not seeing anyone. And he's aware of what's going on. And she and makes a kind of comment, almost, whether it's to one of the disciples, but that she can hear, which is, I'm actually sent to the children of Israel, you know. And if it kind of gets this manic up here as well, what can you what can you do in that context? And she says, well, but even the puppies have to eat. She uses a word for domestic dogs. Even domestic dogs have to eat the crumbs from the master's table. And he addresses her directly. It's almost like you could imagine him being drawn out, which is, he said, you know, your faith has made you well. It's not that Jesus is anti-doing it. It's what he's conscious of, is what he's having to try and protect in terms of space. Because no doubt now she'll go off, and people in Tyre will have heard of him, and suddenly it becomes news. So he moves. He kind of seems to move on, but he takes a bit of circuitous route before he gets back home. And so, where are we? He kind of goes. What's that one about? Tyre and Sidon. Yeah. So he goes up my side, and he comes back down, but instead of coming back through Galilee, he comes back through Decapolis, where now he has fed 5,000 here, and he has cured a demoniac, you know, as well. He's done a few things, but he's less well known on this side than he is on this side, because this is more Gentile territory. So he comes back through the more Gentile territory. He comes right down to the bottom, and then he kind of comes up the other side. And being really blunt, the best way of understanding what he's doing is he is avoiding the crowds. And when he gets to the bit where he's supposed to kind of walk up the side, instead of walking up the side here, he gets a boat and hops up in a couple of stops to get back. So he's trying to get back to their base in Capernaum, but avoiding the crowds, if I can put it that way. But while as he comes through Decapolis, because he had cured the demoniac there, and that was one of the few times he goes and tells them to go and tell everybody. And this time, as he comes through, there's the feeding of the 4,000 now, and who are mainly Gentiles rather than Jewish. They'll be mixed, but this is a more predominantly Gentile area, and because they recognise him and they do come out to him. And then as he comes to the bottom, comes up in the boat. So he returns down the Nutha. So he gets on the boat at the bottom, hops up down the Nutha, and then he goes back to Capernaum. So he makes it now back up to Bethesda, or Bethsaida, I keep calling it Bethsaida, where he heals a blind man before he then heads straight back up north again and gets to Caesarea Philippi. But can you see, at this period, Jesus is not mainly doing ministry in Galilee. He's basically buzzing in and out because that's his base. But he's starting to kind of go wider afield. And it is up there that Jesus confesses him to be the Messiah, which is a key turning point in the gospel story. And we're going to do this fast because we now. He goes up. They go up Mount Hermon. He's transfigured, which is a key thing, because actually what you now have is Elijah represents the prophets, Moses represents the law and the prophets together is the whole of the Old Testament. It's kind of like it's all come together, and in this context, God speaking out of heaven and says, now listen to him. It's like you've had the law, you've had the prophets, now this is all comes together in Jesus. Comes this key moment. They head back down to Capernaum, where he heals an epileptic boy and then returns down to Capernaum. In Galilee, he then decides to head back to his family. We meet his family, I should say. At that point, his family who have already been pressured because of the story that's come up, and he's now cut off from kind of respectable Jewish tradition. There's this kind of slight tense thing where they said, well, you shouldn't be trying, why didn't you do these things down in Jerusalem if you're that famous or whatever? And it's difficult to understand exactly what they're saying, because it's a bit rude, but it could be true too. It's all that sort of thing. But it becomes the key moment. So Jesus says he's not going up with them. to Jerusalem, but he does go up. But he goes back, he doesn't go via the main pilgrim route, he goes via Samaria, because the Samaritans don't go up for Passover. So actually it's a better way to travel, although of course he's not well received as he goes through, because that's why most Jews don't go through Samaria. But he goes back, but actually it means that even if he sets out several days after his family, he's able to get to Jerusalem about the same time, because it's so much quicker to go through Samaria. But as he goes through Samaria, people do join him. So there is a joining of him, and there's some dialogue going on the way, but it's probably less intense than if he tried to take the main pilgrim route at this stage. So he sets his face towards Jerusalem and gets up there with his disciples. So what I haven't touched on here, we'll do it when we do it slowly, is the family incident is probably, it happens in Nazareth. So he's kind of gone to Capernaum, but he's left and he's got to Nazareth. He's just been with his family. He's been probably a little bit, that's where the dialogue happens. And from there, if you look at the map, from Nazareth, the most direct route to Jerusalem is through Samaria. But most Nazareans would actually then take a longer journey, go into the Jordan and walk down, because they would avoid Samaria. Jesus takes the quick route because he said he's not going up publicly, but he tries to go down, and there is some disciple interaction. People do recognise him, but it's probably more manageable. I'll put it that way. So he gets he's been with his family probably because it's Jewish New Year. Just after Jewish New Year, it becomes Feast of Tabernacles, and after that feast, he actually settles near Jericho, we're told. So he does actually do, and all, as I said, all of the Gospels say that Jesus now relocates, that he goes south, and everything is now based down in the south. So there's a kind of a southern phase. Here we go. He makes a big scene at the Feast of the Tabernacles. He does the Water of Life sermon, because we're doing it fast. I won't tell you exactly all the meanings of that, but we will do that when we do that section. There's the incident of the woman caught in adultery, and there's, on the way out, he heals the man born blind. And actually, this is quite a key little bit, because it actually comes back later in John's, when you put the things together. As he leaves, that's the point where Jesus now sends out the 72. The 72 have probably been with him for quite a while, being managed by the 12. Because you notice 72 does divide nicely by 12. So he's probably in those subgroups. He's probably kind of gathered them into those little sub-teams. So he now starts to send them out. And we don't have much in Matthew and Mark's Gospels about this period, but we have most of it from Luke's Gospel. But he is one of the 72. So that's probably why. Because this is the bit that became really alive for him. It wasn't what he heard secondhand, it was what he was part of, you see. And one of the other things that's interesting is that because of this kind of, as I say, the description where it says he sent out the 72 and the 72 returned and they were happy, in our Western mindset we've made that an incident, and then we read everything else as separate. But remember I was saying in Jewish storytelling, here's the summary. Now the next 10 things I'm telling you are probably all part of the context of the 72 being sent out. Now that's important because sometimes you think to yourself, why isn't the story of Lazarus key in Matthew and Mark? Well, there are probably two reasons, I think. One is that Lazarus, as we read in John's Gospel, becomes a target to be killed. And actually, Matthew's Gospel was produced very early on in Jerusalem. And so you don't want to go around advertising all the time who it was. Do you remember you were going to kill him, but you didn't make it? You failed, haha. No, you now achieved it. So there's a good reason for missing out Lazarus, for Matthew and Mark. But secondly, if it happens during the period of out of the 72, everybody is now split up. And actually, if Matthew's Gospel and Mark's are from a core thing, which is that they all observed, because that's what it's the things that we all saw, then they perhaps decided, because they didn't all see it, not to put it in. Does that make sense? Luke, who did see it, doesn't seem to mind so much. John, who did see it. Luke half tells us, but he seems to respect the flow as it was in those early Gospels of not exposing Lazarus. So anyway, this phase means Jesus meets and stays with Martha and Lazarus. That's what comes in Luke's Gospel. We meet Martha and Mary. We don't hear about Lazarus there, but he does meet stays with Martha and Mary. And actually from Luke's Gospel we pick up that Martha seems to be effectively acting as household head, which probably implies their parents have died at some point. Which, if you're pushing a story together for why Mary, as the younger sister, in the pain of loss of parents, might easily get drawn into a lifestyle around Herod with all of the immorality that goes on with that. You know, you can, and they're seen as quite a wealthy family, which is what early church tradition tells us as well. So they're a wealthy family, but now sort of being headed up by the older sister, and she's able to accommodate Jesus's travelling party. Don't know exactly how many at this point, but it's a big enough house that she can accommodate them. So the final months zoom through. So Jesus goes up. He's been based down in the south. People have been going out. We're told that he goes to the place that the 72 are going to. So they're going out kind of ahead of him, and then Jesus is arriving there. But in that process, Jesus goes back for the Feast of Dedication to Jerusalem. It's easier to do some of the smaller feasts now. And so he's there on December the 18th. And on the way in, is probably where we get, in John's Gospel, the kind of follow-up to the man who's been healed. In John's Gospel, we read about Jesus heals the man, and then there's a whole... If you stop and think about it, it doesn't all happen in one day. Actually, there's an argument arrives, and there's a formal council convene, and they formally tell him not to keep saying that Jesus healed him. So all of that's been happening while Jesus has been gone, and he comes back and he meets the man again as he's heading in. So that's enough. I'll say keep going at this point. So he comes in. Actually, he's now very controversial. He's have we done Lazarus yet? Yeah, we did.
Previous
so yeah, it's on the previous slide. Yeah. He's also, Lazarus has been raised from the dead, which is now they're really anti him. There's the man who's been born blind, who's just on the way in, that Jesus reconnected with. So Jesus is coming in. He's really dangerous from the temple point of view, because we're seeing these major miracles. The significance of the man born blind, when we do the significance of the Feast of Tabernacles, is basically Jesus succeeded in what Tabernacles was failing to do. He goes and tells them to wash in the pool of Siloam. The Feast of Tabernacles, they collect water from the pool of Siloam every day as a symbol of healing. You know, he didn't get healed in that process. Jesus healed him. You know, so Jesus is really disruptive to their power base and their system. And so as a result, Jesus withdraws back to Bethbara. Oh no, here it is. This is where Lazarus has died. Sorry, yeah. So Feast of Dedication, he comes up for and reconnects with the man who was born blind, who we discover now has been kicked out, and they've told him to stop telling everyone that it was Jesus who healed him. He withdraws to Bethbara, and while he's at Bethbara, he hears about Lazarus being unwell, who he's stayed with just recently as they started their ministry trip, stayed with Martha and Mary and family. Word comes to him. Jesus raises him after 4 days, which breaks the kind of a little thing about not really dead, you've been dead, so you're dead 4 days, which actually is not at all uncommon in cultures where you can be in near-death comas, and so you know you're really dead after 4 days, and that's probably the significance of it. And the priests have decided now to kill Jesus because of the story of Lazarus. Jesus retreats a little bit north up to Ephraim in Samaria, which is just here. Here's Ephraim in Samaria. So he makes that his base, and he does kind of the final looping kind of like tour before he gets back to Jerusalem. So just before Passover, Jesus sets out the final journey from Ephraim. He kind of goes up. He just touches the borderland between Galilee, so he goes right up to the edge of Galilee. He heads on back, comes back down through Jericho and Perea. In Jericho, he meets Zacchaeus. Remember that story as they come through. They then head on from there. 6 days before Passover, they arrive at Jerusalem, which is where we're going to leave it, because at Easter time, this is a quick advert for Easter time, we're going to do a walkthrough of the last week of Jesus' life. And what I've done is I've got 12 big playing boards, like Monopoly sets of Jerusalem, and 72 stand-up characters that I've had made up. And you can, have you done this, Jane? Yeah. And you can actually mark them and move them through, and kind of actually see it visually kind of happening, because there's so much that happens in the last week, so many characters that just to see, and the reason we do it is because you will still get told, even if you go to an evangelical Bible school, that you cannot, you can't mix, that you can't make the four Gospels fit together. But the thing is, we'll actually do it. But it's hard because there are so many characters. So that's why I figured the only way you can really get your head around it is to actually move them as they move, if that makes sense. So we're going to do that in the last week. So I think that was my last slide.
So that's why.
There you go. So it feels to me like, sorry, to you it might feel the other way. To me it feels like we've been too fast because we've had to skip over so much. But yeah, there we go. Oops. I'm going to stop.